Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS, episode 126. Thank you very much for joining us. If you're watching on YouTube or Twitter or X now, or any other of social media platforms, including Facebook, thanks so much. It's lovely for us to have you with us. We've got a really great interview and interviewee this evening. We're going to be through to 9 o'clock, a little bit shorter than normal, but 45 minutes, which I think will still leave you with lots of new ideas, and I'm sure some questions to answer as well. We're joined tonight by a gentleman I met probably a couple of months ago. He was recommended to me as an absolute expert to speak about the connection between our economic system and the climate crisis. So James Dyke's a senior lecturer in global systems at the University of Exeter. He's written extensively about climate change and often highlights that business as usual will not solve the ecological crisis. And in this interview, we're going to try and connect some of the science to the political economy. So James, welcome to SCOTONOMICS.
Hello. Well, thank you so much for having me.
No, it's great. A really good opportunity for me to get as much from you and much of that brain as I possibly can. Before we discuss the connection between climate change, climate science, and the economy, could you just give us a quick summary of the extent of the challenge we face? You know, principally as we look at ensuring that we draw down more carbon and other greenhouse gases than we put into the atmosphere. Give us an idea of the scope of the ecological challenge that we face, and then we're going to look at that within a political and an economic concept. So an easy one for you, James, to start.
I've had easier questions for sure. Well, it's very timely that we do have this discussion, especially in the political and economic context, because we have the Tony Blair Institute report that has been doing the rounds today. It's an entirely kind of fatuous presentation of the challenge and the scale, the magnitude of the challenge. What we have got to do is essentially unroll centuries of industrialization, not just in terms of carbon pollution, but also in terms of the destruction of nature. We swung a wrecking ball through the biosphere, 4 centuries, such that concentrations of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere and the way in which we're changing the climate is unprecedented for many, many millions of years now, tens of millions of years. And we are probably at the advent of the start of one of the greatest mass extinction events in the 3.8 billion year history of life on this planet. And if we don't undertake the rapid actual phase out cessation of primarily burning fossil fuels, we can talk about the food system later, but we have got to stop burning coal, oil and gas. If we don't do that, potentially now within essentially decades, then we are going to enter into a much more turbulent, disruptive and violent climate that has the potential not just to shave a few percent off of GDP, but to completely devastate certain nations, certain regions with what sounds like outlandish worst case scenarios where significant fractions of the Earth's planet are literally uninhabitable. Whatever is left of humanity is in the refugia of Northern Europe and maybe areas of North America. So it's probably unprecedented. It's actually here now. So we're actually within dangerous climate change. The climate and ecological crisis is completely real. It's unprecedented in scope and scale, and we have yet to see any credible political or economic response to the scale of that challenge.
Mm-hmm. And you're not, you mentioned a couple of kind of economic aspects there, talking about GDP principally, and this idea that we face a climate crisis, and it's likely that it's going to do more damage than a couple of GDP. And before we go into all the questions, I just kind of want to highlight the importance of this idea that the climate or climate change and other ecological impacts will only have a couple of percent impact on GDP. So why did you mention that figure? Could you give us a little bit of the history to why some people, or let's not me give you the answer, why did you say that a couple of percentage? Is the people who think that might be the case?
Yeah, the reason I mention that is because there has been this kind of sense of complacency from significant sectors of the political class, but then also industry, commercial, pension funds are a good example.
Mm.
When you ask a pension fund, certainly pretty much most pension funds in the UK, what would be the consequences, the value of your portfolio of assessments that are supporting that pension fund if we warmed to, let's say, 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century? And as that warming increases from where we are now, which is essentially 1.5, 1.4, 1.5, what's that going to do? So one way that economists talk about that is like a damage function. That comes from at the time, the pioneering work of people like William Nordhaus, who tried to understand what would be the economic consequences of climate change, because as it gets hotter, it's going to, for example, make it harder to work outside. Right, we're going to see more disruption of the food system. It might be more difficult to generate energy because thermal power plants can't operate when the water gets too hot. Right, so there is this a long history now of work that's tried to work out, as it gets warmer, what's that going to do to the economy. And for many years, the conclusion of that work was, well, 3 degrees by the end of the century, maybe 4 degrees by the end of the century, it won't really do much at all. And infamously, Nordhaus himself argued that really we should be looking at about 3 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century, which is actually what we should aim for in terms of it's optimal. Because if you decarbonize too fast, then you're going to put a brake on economic growth. There's all these kind of opportunity costs you've got when you try to phase out coal, oil, and gas too quickly. What that means, unfortunately, is that at the heart of pretty much every single pension fund and financial institution and many governments, at the heart of their response to the climate and ecological crisis, is this wildly inaccurate and dangerous assumption that they don't really have to worry about climate change very much. And in some respects, that begins to explain why has it been so hard for politicians and industry to respond to this evident increase in danger and risk.
Fantastic. And just to say, James, Kieran's joined us now. So hello, Kieran.
Hello.
So I was unable to get you on there. Okay, James, that's fantastic. And yes, we are aware of the work of William Nordhaus, and we've mentioned it a few times on the show. But I just wanted to make sure that the audience had that, because what you said there was, let's not say you're completely blaming it on an economist or a school of economics, but what you're saying is economists said that we can warm the planet and we'll only lose 2 or 3% of GDP. And the really important word that you said there was about there being an optimum increase. Yeah. And William Nordhaus looks at all this and said, actually, this will cost us a lot of money. So we have to make sure that we spend this money and it doesn't damage our GDP to a certain extent. And when you balance everything out, 3 degrees, I'm trying to remember. I'm sure you're right, being a climate scientist, but I think he actually went and said, I think between 3 and 4 degrees global warming was optimal. So I think he was even imagine it being hotter. Before we go into the economic detail of that, could you give us an idea of what a world looks like at 2 degrees? Not 3, not 4, but what's your feel for what that world that no one has experienced, but no human being has experienced before, a world of 2 degrees higher than where we were at the Industrial Revolution? What does that world look like, James?
I think it's really important to be clear that we don't know. Right, we can't say with any sense of certainty what a 2 degrees Celsius warmer world is going to look any more than we could have predicted what's happening now at essentially 1.4. What we can say is that the impacts are happening sooner than we thought in terms of extreme temperature, global temperature anomalies, devastating weather events, things like flooding events, extreme rainfall. The things that we can predict reasonably well would be things like sea level rise up to a certain extent. But really, these kind of first order climate risks are not the ones that I'm most worried about. The things that I'm really worried about are the consequences of those first order impacts on other bits of the climate system, and then how human society is going to. Shit. something very large and heavy just landed on a glass thing. I'm fine as long as I don't move. Okay, right. So, an example of an unforeseen risk.
There you go. There you go. Perfect time.
There were structural instabilities in that system such that it looked okay, and it might be moving in a certain easy to predict manner, but it's the sudden, discontinuous, catastrophic in that instance impact. So one of the class of those kind of risks that we're spending a lot of time thinking about are like tipping elements, tipping points in the climate system. Classic ones are being ice sheets. So the Western Antarctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet. There's a certain amount of warming, at which point when they begin to melt, they accelerate that melting process. And then kind of when it starts, that's not going to stop, right? Until you've got pretty much the complete deglaciation, de-icing of the Greenland area, and maybe even significant sections of Western Antarctica become, those glaciers become completely disintegrated or destroyed. The good news is that those things will take probably centuries, given how massive they are. Because the bad news is, even if we suddenly reduce emissions and maybe even lower temperatures somehow, you've lost them, right? But the more concerning ones are probably the Atlantic overturning meridional ocean currents, the AMOC, right? It's a component of the Gulf Stream, but there's now really, I think, abundant evidence that's demonstrate that these currents have flipped in the past, and they can do that quite abruptly.
That research has been very recent, hasn't it, and come from various sources, that it looks like the AMOC might be, if it's not switching off, it's certainly decreasing. That's fairly recent, isn't it, and really surprised climate scientists.
Yeah, so the idea that current can be bistable is probably a few decades old, because it relates to long-term kind of natural climate change. It's been the last 10 to 20 years that there's been a kind of progressive increase in what human impacts on the climate are going to do to that system. And it's only been in the last 5 years or so that the assessment of when that might flip has really changed, such that if you were to ask Stefan Ramsdorf, he's a kind of he's based at, is he at Potsdam? He's a German climate scientist, and if you'd have asked him 5 years ago, what's the chance of that happening anytime before the middle of this century, he would have given you a very small number, right? The way he's been responding to these questions, it might even be odds on, right? It might be a flip of a coin, it might actually be worse. And of course, given emissions are going up, given that warming seems to be in some ways understood and other ways not understood, warming is actually accelerating, the chance that there could be a significant slowing down of that current and maybe even a shutting off sometime this century is becoming really very alarmingly high. And of course, when you're thinking about climate consequences, that is absolutely the one that you want to avoid at all costs, because it would have the potential to completely devastate the way that we grow food in Europe, Northern Europe and North America, but also the way it transports this kind of vast amounts of heat and energy from the lower latitudes up towards the poles. It could have a significant and prolonged and pronounced impact on climate patterns across much of the rest of the world, right? So that's got an immediate and permanent consequence on, let's say, food security. So when you begin to look at how different elements of the climate system could impact the way in which we try to grow food, gain access to energy, get access to fresh water, in some instances, physical space, because above 1.5 degrees Celsius, there will be some nations, low-lying island nation states, that probably won't exist anymore because they'll be literally underwater. When you begin to put those things together, and you try to connect the consequences of one tipping point with another kind of social, political, economic effect, that's when it gets particularly frightening, I think. This notion that we will see a progressive, smooth, nibbling away of economic activity, but that's not how human societies will respond. But moreover, that's not how we think the climate system is going to respond. It will be okay, and then with a very potentially little warning, it's going to come down and smash things.
And to go back and to connect that with the William Nordhaus model, this was looking at climate change as a kind of linear process, that it would certainly the world was warming and there would be an impact, but this would be gradual, and there was no I don't even think there was an understanding, but there was certainly no integration of this idea that things could tip and that we could shift from a different scenario very, very quickly. And that's what you see in a lot of neoclassical models, is the linear nature rather than understanding of a dynamic system. So looking at let's move into the kind of economic sphere now. If I was to say to you, as a climate scientist, and you're looking at the economy, but not from an economics perspective, what does the economy need to do differently to start? I'm not even going to say start eating away at the problem, but slowing down the problems that we have. What do we need to do as an economy? And to broaden that out, because I think this is really important and something we always say in the show, the economy is just part of society. So that question, a much better framing for that question is, what does societies have to do to start to slow down these potentially catastrophic changes?
I suppose I think what we need to consider is what are our economies for? What's the point of the goods and services that our economic systems produce if the consequence of those economic systems are potential ruin to ultimately everyone? I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a billionaire and you think you've got a private army somewhere in the South Pacific, or you've bought significant areas of New Zealand. You're not gonna escape from this. I mean, that might help explain why Elon Musk is so interested in Mars, right? But there needs to be that fundamental reassessment of the purpose, utility, the normative elements of any kind of economic system. Unfortunately, we persist in what I sometimes call this phony war against climate breakdown, which is essentially nothing fundamentally different needs to happen. We can continue to pursue economic growth. I mean, we have a relatively new government in the United Kingdom, and one of its first kind of clear policy directions, the framework in which it was going to conduct government, was growth. Right, growth was, we're going to have this engine of growth, which is going to provide all the things that we need for a well-functioning, mature democracy, from what's meant to be a progressive political party, within which there are some people who completely understand the scale of the crisis. We continue to persist to think that we can continue to grow the size of economies and therefore also increase the total amount of energy and materials that we can consume, but at the same time decouple them, right? So it's all about decoupling economic growth from, let's say, just in a relatively narrow context, carbon emissions. And some rich, well-industrialized nations seem to have, in some respects, done that with regard to, let's say, their energy sector, maybe more broadly, their entire national inventory emissions. For example, the UK, right? So the UK has continued to see economic growth, but at the same time, over the last few decades, the total amount of carbon that has come from within its borders have actually kind of gone down. And you can also see that in the United States as well. The trouble, of course, is that we, until relatively recently, certainly before Trump's second administration, lived in a very globalized society in which many of the goods and services that we consume in the UK were not made within the borders of the UK. And so what goes on in China or India or Thailand or South Korea is just as important. It makes no sense just to look at national attempts to decouple. We really need to look at the global effort, because the global climate doesn't really care where emissions come from. So if I was to summarize what I think economics needs to do, it needs to take seriously the need to stop using fossil fuels, whilst acknowledging that fossil fuels continue to provide around 80% of global world energy, right? So that's the fundamental problem. When you've got an energy source responsible for 80% of what underlies economic performance, which literally powers our economies, the very, very rapid phase out of that could do untold economic harm. And so it's the challenge that we've got, and because we've left it so late, the challenge is only getting larger and larger, is how do we apply this essentially emergency brake to the consumption of fossil fuels, therefore the production of carbon pollution, without completely wrecking the global economy? Because there's the potential to do that, right? And I don't see certainly I don't see any national government having any kind of credible plan how to do that. They're still tinkering with small rates of decoupling. And then the solution, their proposed solution, would be arguably technological fixes. So I mentioned Tony Blair Institute at the start, classic example. Don't worry, we don't need to ask people to, let's say, fly less. We can simply take out that extra carbon dioxide through carbon removal technologies, or maybe even geoengineering.
Okay, fantastic. I'm going to bring Kieran in now for a question, and then Hasbury, I'll ask your question. Oh, actually, I'm going to wait for that one because that's right into the kind of like practical elements. So it's a really good question, but I'll mention it a little bit. I'll bring it in a little bit later. Kieran?
Yeah, it was really disappointing today to hear Blair's comments, but I guess I'm not surprised. Obviously, in 1997, when I was living in London, I was delighted that Blair got in, but quickly his politics turned into something quite right wing. We've discussed Nordhaus in this program before, and I was really shocked when I learned about him through Steve Keen and the things that he was saying. So, I don't have your kind of knowledge about the Earth systems, but I did cover them in first year. I did anatomical sciences, and we covered, sort of from the Hadean to the Cenozoic and all those different phases. So I have an understanding. I wouldn't say it's a good understanding that we can't go up to these temperatures. This is not going to make the planet a nice place for us to live on. So understand that very clearly. And as far as I'm concerned, all national governments need to be on a war footing now, and they need to be doing it now. And yes, the people that are currently in power in the UK, in the US, and in other countries just don't seem to understand the seriousness of the situation we're in. And I guess probably from your understanding of our systems, obviously much more intense than mine. Mine's very basic. Maybe you could paint some horror pictures about where we're going to be, because I think people need to have those pictures in their heads to understand. And I think this program that we're making can hopefully paint some of those pictures. And I think that you need to be explicit, James.
Okay. I mean, for many years, I think the climate science community held what we call this information deficit model, that the reason that people are not responding to the crisis, whether that's wider society or politicians, because they don't have sufficient information or knowledge about it. So the role of climate scientists is to do the science, most famously, through the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then we'll do these big reports. And as the reports, I mean, you look at the first report that was produced in the mid 1990s, and as they've come out pretty much every 4 years, the language is changing, the certainty is increasing, the severity of the impacts. There's a very clear message, such that pretty much every single national scientific organization, every single scientific body, every university or major research institute will say essentially the same thing, is that if we don't rapidly decarbonize, we're going to be, certainly before the end of this century, in a place that's going to be not just dangerous, but lethal, right? So there are already conditions that we've experienced that are literally lethal in terms of temperature and humidity. So there are places now in the latitudes where, when it's particularly warm and it's particularly humid, you can't be outside, right? Even if you're in the shade, even if you're sitting down, even if you've got an infinite supply of bottled water, given the intense temperature and humidity, if you just stay out in that environment for, let's say, a few hours, you would die, because you just can't export the heat that gets produced by your bodies. And we see, I mean, even by the middle of this century, so now we're only talking about a couple of decades, that those kind of literally uninhabitable regions are going to increase across typically the lower latitudes. And more generally, when you think about it, well, okay, there's literally a lethal environment. More generally, when you look at the environmental conditions, sometimes we describe it as the environmental niche, the range of temperatures, average temperatures, but then also the kind of extreme temperatures you might experience. Humans have existed or inhabited, certainly human civilization is existed within a really quite narrow niche. And that kind of explains why you saw the advent of civilization where you did. And even with adaptations where we can still kind of where most human population centers are, right? Now we've got the extremely worrying situation where the world's most populous places and the world's regions which are increasing population at the greatest rate because they're going through this process of demographic transition, so they currently got quite high birth rates, are exactly the same regions where we expect the most pronounced climate impacts to be in terms of extreme temperatures and humidity and the disruption of the ability to produce food. So you're looking at the potential for mass hunger, mass starvation, and of course when people have got the abilities they're going to move, right? So you're looking at mass migration probably to countries within that locale. So we're not going to see an increase in people coming across the channel, right? We're going to see significant disruption in Africa, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East in particular, in the Indian subcontinent, in Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. There will be probably, if we continue in the way that we are, we will see the greatest forced displacement of people in all of human history at a time of increasing political friction and absolute breakdown in certain nation states, right? So these, I mean, maybe 20 years ago, these would have been seen as just really quite outlandish, and probably the label they would give you would be alarmist, right? In some respects, these are now the central estimates, right? These are the kind of things that might happen if things don't go particularly bad. If things go particularly bad, if we've underestimated climate sensitivity, if the Greenland ice sheet and maybe even AMOC is already going at about 1.5, right? If the Amazon dieback at the moment, I mean, already we're seeing regions of the Amazon, which is one of the world's greatest stores of carbon dioxide, bits of that is not absorbing carbon anymore. It's coming out the soils, right? If we've been unfortunate or ignorant and failed to see important dynamics, then those systems may, within years or decades, tip, right? And the consequences for that could be a rapid escalation of warming where we'll see 3-4 degrees Celsius, maybe even more by the end of the century. And then you are looking at a scenario in which crudely put, billions of people are going to die, right? The total number of people on the planet will be a significant reduction of what they are today, and in some respects that information deficit model just obviously it doesn't work because that's not what motivates people, and these kind of apocalyptic scenarios often don't motivate people either, because in my experience of such matters, it's easy for them to consider them to be just wildly implausible, alarmist, and so detached from the day-to-day business of either running a company or an industry or the necessities of a political party in power, that it's just too big a stretch, right? It doesn't really connect to the values that they have, their sense of priorities, and in some respects their roles and responsibilities. So it's this it's wildly frustrating, of course, situation to be in, but also one that is very unsettling, right? And so that's why, in some respects, in my experience of such matters, there's been a massive amount of compartmentalization, right? We're not really thinking through the consequences, and probably quite a lot of denial in there as well.
So I'm still going to try and get you to be more explicit about this. So I know maybe 5 years ago, I saw the first forecast that India had 50 degrees in India, and that's not a temperature that people can live at, as you've already painted, and that's going to increase. We've seen a fire in Australia a few years ago, which destroyed a landmass in Australia that was the size of Ireland, and all the flora and fauna that were contained within that size of landmass. This is huge, and it's very far away from people here. And now in Scotland, you're starting to see that we're regularly getting a lot of fires here. That's happening now. Our ground is drier. And when these fires are happening here, they are devastating. We do not have the kind of resource as far as the fire service is concerned. And I know that they're training themselves to be better at understanding how to do this. But I still think that eventually resource against fires is going to come to a point where we can't control that as well. We've also had devastating floods here in Scotland, in Angus particularly recently, and we've also had devastating winds here in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, where I live, where I've seen trees with tree trunks this big snap in half or be pulled out of the ground. I've never seen that in my lifetime here. So I'm already starting to see these differences very clearly here. And AMOC, my understanding of AMOC, if that breaks down, that would make the west coast of Scotland and perhaps Ireland uninhabitable. It would be too cold to live there. Is that your understanding of what would happen if AMOC breaks down?
Okay, yes. So the AMOC has the potential to be, yes, to devastate communities, right? But even before I'll talk about AMOC, but even before that, this notion that we can just, we just adapt, right? This notion that it will have a marginal impact on, it invokes a heroic ability for human societies to adapt. And we understand that there are essentially limits to adaptation, right? And the UK is no stranger to that. This notion of managed realignment, through kind of natural geological processes, coastal regions in the UK are undergoing essentially local sea level rise. And there's so much you can do about that. There's so much concrete you can pour, or beach nourishment. You can keep putting the beach back after a storm. But there is a finite capacity of your abilities to do that. Right. At the moment, as we speak, we are seeing that situation rapidly unwind on the eastern seaboard of the United States, where increasing intensity of storms are increasing the costs required in order to maintain these kind of coastal communities. The only reason they keep doing it in some of these places is because the value of the property is so high, because you've got very rich people. But it's going to come a point when you just can't, in some respects, in some places there physically just won't be enough sand, right, or the kind of resources that you want. And it's at that point when you stop the adaptation response, the system rapidly collapses. So when it comes to managed realignment, you don't have that community anymore. You just have to go. And we'll see that in spades with AMOC, right? Because the AMOC is responsible for bathing the British Isles, an island in this really warm water. We have remarkably mild winters. If that stops, we're looking at average annual temperature decrease of 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius, but with extraordinarily severe winters that we're used to. But perhaps just as importantly, there'll be a significant disruption in precipitation, right? You will see the way in which we've grown food on these lands for hundreds and years, certainly since industrial agriculture, just won't work anymore, right? Now, that's not to say you won't be able to grow anything. There are trees that grow at high latitudes where it gets very cold, but you don't have, you're not going to have the same kind of arable farming, or I'm based in the southwest, down in Devon, you're not going to have dairy farms, right? And when you look at not just the disruption, but also a reduction in the total amount of food, well, then if we're to continue to be food secure, then we're going to have to import more food, aren't we? But at the same time, you're going to see massive disruption of food systems elsewhere in Europe and North America, and probably globally, because climate change impacts will be accelerated further as a consequence of AMOC disruption. So in some places, you are looking at an absolute reduction in food security just through availability. And then when you're doing that, then you're looking at, what's the possible maximum size of the population? It's these really fundamentals as to what you need in order to survive. So this is why I would argue, along with pretty much most climate scientists actually, that the AMOX tipping is the one thing that you must avoid at all costs. The analogy is like in the aviation industry, you know, the tolerances to failure for loss of airframe, you know, we're looking at, you know, a millionth of a millionth in terms of passenger numbers. It's something that you must avoid. It if an airline loses an airframe, like a plane crash, it's got the potential to actually bankrupt the airline, or it's an absolutely catastrophic event, and they put their entire risk and process procedures around avoidance of that. That's completely not what we're doing. You would imagine that's what the priority of climate policy should be. What is the worst case scenario that's got the potential to devastate human civilization? Okay, well, let's focus all our efforts to make sure that we decrease the risk of that as much as we kind of feasibly can, given all the other challenges that we've got. That's not what we're doing, right? What we're doing is we're continuing to think that we can progressively decouple and essentially hope, right, that the worst case scenarios don't arise. And I would argue that the more science that we do on these kind of tipping elements, if you think about that distribution of how likely they are, that distribution seems to be shifting and becoming more and more likely at lower and lower temperatures. And we are probably going to burst right through the lower thresholds of that distribution. So we're entering into an extraordinarily dangerous period.
Thank you, James. That's scene set for sure. Well, but and however, about 20 years ago, lots of climate scientists and economists got together and they solved this problem, James. They solved this with the idea of net zero. So would you just like to explain to me why net zero is the thing that we need and how it is going to solve all of our problems, touching on where this idea of net zero came from? I've set you up there. You need to be able to bat this one away.
Okay, I'll knock it in the net then, shall I? So the way I explain or talk about some of the history of net zero, the science of net zero, the climate science of net zero comes from the work of people like Miles Allen from Oxford and a whole bunch of other climate scientists who, a number of years ago now, realized or established the science, the amount of warming that we see, so we're currently about 1.4, that is the result of what we call cumulative emissions. So the reason it's so much warmer is because there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So think about a bucket or a bath, right? And we've been filling that bath with carbon dioxide. It's like a tap. And as the water level, the carbon dioxide level has been going up, then temperatures kind of track it. So what that means is if you kind of stop the tap, right? If you just turn the tap off, then CO2 kind of gets stabilized. There's a lot of nuance here, but what's most important, temperatures get stabilized. So if you're looking to stop warming at 1 or 1.2 or 5, you know, whatever it is, then you can fill it up, you can fill the atmosphere up to a certain level, and then you stop, right? Now, if you look at the Paris Agreement back in 2015, which was a tremendous achievement for the people most exposed or vulnerable to climate change, low-lying island nation states, people live in, you know, deltic regions in Bangladesh or something, the people on the front line of climate change, anything above 1.5 for them is kind of existential. And so the victory of Paris Agreement, the Paris Accords, was that the international community would agree that it would limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And since then, I think it's been understood as 1.5, right? What would we have needed to do in 2015 in order to give us a decent chance, let's say a 66, a 2 in 3 chance of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius? Well, we need to look at where the line is in the bath and how far it is until it reaches 1.5. And there wasn't really much difference between those 2 points, right? We're talking, you know, probably less than a couple of decades of emissions or something, much less than a decade. So what does that mean? We've got to turn the tap off, right? There's just no, you know, the basic physics is if you want to limit warming to that, you've got to stop the water level going up. So the response of the 2015 Paris Agreement was all nations collectively decided they would turn their respective taps off, right? That didn't happen. That didn't happen because turning the taps off would perhaps have a drag on economic growth. So how on earth are you going to continue to say that 1.5 is still alive? Net zero. Because what you'll do is as well as fiddling around with taps, what you do, you put a tube in and you begin to siphon the water out. If I can take that water out at the same rate that it comes in, then that water level, that atmospheric CO2 level is gonna stay constant. And that's what net zero is. So the net zero promise is that we can continue to not only fail to close the taps, but that we can actually even continue, in some places, keep them opening them, right? The job then is just to find them out. How do you get the water out the bath at an equal rate, right? And that's where the carbon dioxide removal technologies come from, which are increasingly being seen as a central component, right? So then you'll hear this expression here. Scientists say for us to have any chance of limiting warming to no more than 1.5, we must remove N billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere. Scientists don't really say that. What they really say is that if you don't reduce emissions, then just from basic physics, right, you'd have to take it out. Unfortunately, there's no way of us taking it out. Those technologies literally don't exist beyond some demonstrator projects, right?
Mm.
So when the Tony Blair Institute landed their report, it surprised me not at all that a central part of their response to the climate crisis is basically, well, just carbon dioxide removal. It's a kind of a burn now, pay later approach. Yeah. It's a completely fatuous invocation of future technologies, which is going to fix it, which just so happens to allow politicians completely off the hook.
Absolutely. It's completely allows business as usual.
Yeah.
That's what net zero is. And it's painted by a lot of people as this kind of significant change to the way that we lead our lives. Is that, you know, net zero is affecting so many different areas, be it how you drive into the city or the price that you pay for your electricity. But it is literally, it's literally erasing a tiny little bit around the edges. I also so another economic question for you is that, okay, so net zero is not going to work, James, but as economists, we've all got together and we've said it's simple. All you have to do is put a tax on carbon and use carbon offsetting. So we're doing all the heavy lifting for you climate scientists, guys. We're coming up with all of these solutions. So could you tell me about carbon taxes and carbon offsets as quick as you can, so we can get another couple of questions before we lose you?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, let's do the carbon offsets, the kind of the gilt offset. So the reason airlines offer you the opportunity to offset the carbon produced by your flight is not because they care about the climate, it's because they want to sell more airline tickets, and your guilt about flying could impede your purchase of the ticket. There are lots and lots of good reasons why rich nations, rich individuals send money to places in, let's say, the global south to protect their forests or to swap out burning of wood with more efficient cook stove. There are lots of reasons to do that. There are very, very few reasons that have got anything to do with the climate. The majority, in some instances, the vast majority of climate carbon offsetting schemes have been shown to be, from a climate perspective, absolutely worthless. They don't work, right? Carbon offsetting and the carbon credits and the voluntary carbon market has tremendous potential, but it has been absolutely corrupted by market forces, because there's been a race to the bottom. Because if I can sell you a ton of carbon removal for $5 and somebody else will do it for 10, you're gonna buy from me, right? And the way in which we determine whether or not that carbon removal is credible or effective has been extraordinarily lacking. So just recently, I was part of a working group that's advised our university to not use carbon offsetting at all. It doesn't do anything. We should use that money to accelerate our decarbonisation. Carbon tax as a policy, well, I mean, it's certainly been argued by economists and actually some climate scientists that it's important, that it might have a role. If it resulted in a reduction in the combustion of coal, oil and gas, if it resulted in a reduction in the finance of the exploration and exploitation of new oil and gas, then okay, right? I mean, I'm not an economist. I'm entirely agnostic about whether or not that policy instrument is going to be effective. But just the notion of a carbon tax alone just has always seemed to me just to be grossly insufficient.
Fantastic. Kieran, have you got another question? I've got a couple from the audience before you go, James, but Kieran, if you've got one, you could drop one in.
I guess another scenario that I was thinking about as well, I read a book a few years ago called The World Without Us by Alan Wiseman. And he talks about, if we disappeared, what would happen? And, in New York and London, they rely on pumping to keep water out of their subway systems. So is that something that you think that would quickly be overwhelmed in a situation where we have another degree of warming?
Yeah, the general picture that we've got is, in order to adapt to climate change, we're going to need to, if we're not careful, consume more energy and materials, right? So the classic example would be increasing temperatures is already driving the increase in air conditioning, which is driving the energy demand, which is driving increased fossil fuel use, because you can't deploy renewables fast enough to satisfy that increased energy demand. And that's also, look, data centers, big tech, generative AI, it's being proposed as some kind of climate solution. They're throwing these data centers, hyperscale data centers, up so fast they can't really connect them to the grid. They're being increasingly powered by fossil fuel generators, like, in some instances diesel, but an awful lot of natural gas. There's no, I mean, in some respects, it's kind of just basic physics, right? That the space that we've got to continue to kind of thread civilization, organized societies through the rest of this century, and also far beyond, is becoming narrower and narrower and narrower, right? There has to be a priority to provide as much scope and adaptive capacity. And this idea that we can just throw increasing amounts of tech at it are just completely deluded.
Fantastic. Well, here's a tech question from Hashbury then. Could mass building of desalination plants be used to irrigate places such as sub-Saharan areas while helping to reduce rising sea levels? A bit fantastic, I know, but at least I'm trying. Okay, give us a quick one on that, James.
Well, we could see there's a region that's already doing it. So Middle Eastern nations have invested significantly in desalination. Saudi Arabia is a good example. They've also extracted an awful lot of what we call fossil water. They had vast reserves of fossil water, large aquifers, to the extent that they actually became a significant exporter of arable crops. They were growing vast kind of plots of fields of arable crops kind of in the desert. And what they've done, they've depleted those kind of aquifers, they depleted those fossil water. There's increasing interest in switching desalination, which unfortunately is very energy intensive. Okay, so then we'll just throw out more energy systems. Well, if those energy systems are powered by fossil fuels, then that's going to make it worse. But even if they're powered by renewables, at the same time, we need to use that renewable capacity to rapidly phase out all the fossil fuels, right? So even though there's been an exponential increase in the deployment, let's say solar power, which is amazing, that has to actually displace the coal, oil and gas. Until we actually see the reduction in coal, oil and gas, that I'm not arguing it doesn't do anything. I mean, probably the situation would have been worse, but that's the tap that we need to turn off. So when you actually start to do the kind of the energetics and the energy economics, where we need to deploy those renewable capacities, then in some respects, you could imagine a world in which there is significant deployment of solar photovoltaics in, let's say, North Africa, and you can distribute that energy around. And then if you've got essentially unlimited energy, you can do all sorts, right? We've got to get there, right? The next few decades are going to be absolutely critical. We can't invoke science fiction solutions to avoid having to make the really difficult decisions that we need to make today.
Fantastic. And I'm going to give last question over to Paul Scholes here. Have you looked at degrowth as a framework for a managed reduction? I think that's really important, being someone who classes himself a degrowther, is that degrowth is a managed reduction in, as Paul puts it here, activities, energy use, emissions and pollution. So just a quick summary of your thoughts on degrowth, James.
Yeah, it continues to be a controversial topic. Lots of people do not like it. They're kind of for various reasons. I think I might prefer the term rebalanced, right? There are some places, there are significant numbers of a significant fraction of human population that probably need to consume more energy and more materials, right? They don't have a fridge. They've got no access to electricity, right? They're using solid fuel to cook their food. Their air quality is really unhealthy. They need more stuff, right? In order for them to be able to consume more, the hyper-consumerist societies, such as the United Kingdom, need to consume less. It's a rebalance, right? There's more than enough headspace. We're talking about a fractional decrease of the world's richest people, which have a disproportionate impact on the climate and also ecology in terms of the land use change and devastation of biodiversity. That's where we need to focus our efforts. They just need to have less in order that more can, in some respects, literally be transferred in terms of wealth, technology, capability, but also to allow others to have a decent quality of life. There is still pretty much enough of the earth to go round. So really important work from people like Julia Steinberger has shown that from the basic kind of, not just the physics, but the ecology, everybody can have a really good quality of life, right? 8, 9, 10, 11 billion people could live perfectly happy, good, decent lives, and we'd have a safe and stable climate. But that has to be a rebalancing of our economies. And of course, we are nowhere near being able to have grown-up discussions about what that would actually require.
Fantastic. And I think some of that work says that, we're not talking about going back to the Dark Ages.
No, not at all.
16th century. We're talking about living the type of life that, maybe the three of us grew up in the late 70s, early 80s. It's kind of pushing us back a couple of generations in terms of our material consumption. So this isn't some radical, idea that we cut back on everything to such a huge degree that we've never experienced. It's just talking about how we used to very successfully and very happily lead our lives. But I think you've summarized degrowth really well there. It is about a rebalancing. Degrowth, not for everyone. It is that opportunity to look at the whole system and see where you need to reduce and where you need to increase. James, as another, this happened last time we had a conversation. This could have gone on for hours and hours. We're so grateful we've managed to get 50 minutes from you. We'll make sure that we highlight the work that you're doing to our audience, and it would be great to see you again. Maybe an update in a year's time to see where we are. But I found that absolutely fascinating. Got really good feedback from the people watching as well. So James, thank you very much. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you again soon.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to come and speak to you. And thanks for all the questions.
Thanks, James. Bye now.
All right, cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, yeah, just again, thanks to James for joining us. An incredibly well-known, well-informed climate scientist. And I just wish that, we were able to get those messages in front of more economists. We can get the message in front of our fantastic viewers and listeners and those who engage with us on other platforms. But a lot of the things, it'd be really difficult for people to say. They don't sound, I hate to use that word, common sense, but logical and science-based. And this is where a certain strand of the economics profession has done such a huge disservice to us all by considering that their views are more important and should be considered more important than the climate scientists. And hopefully the people who are watching see that our heterodox approach to economics takes this on board and starts to factor our economic responses to the science. And we don't say to the scientists, well, it'll be fine. We say, if that's the evidence, then how do we design a system for an economy to make sure that that system still works? But that conversation doesn't seem to be happening within the mainstream and unfortunately the more influential elements of our economy. Karen, do you want to give us your quick thoughts before we head off for the night?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the degrowth aspect and thinking that perhaps America is going to go through a period of degrowth now that they're going to have to pay some quite large tariffs on things that they've been used to getting actually very cheaply. And certainly watching American programs, sometimes I'm quite shocked at the amount of consumerism that happens in some of their programs. And, actually with Netflix, there's some programs that come on there about, estate agents looking for places for really wealthy people. And I find it all quite shocking, that you think about redistribution. I mean, these people could give up some of their houses, and possibly make some of their houses that are far too big for them, maybe homes for elderly people. I don't know. I mean, there's it's been kind of shocking for me to see through Netflix so many visions of how things are going on in other parts of the world. I mean, I really appreciate the fact that I can listen and watch programs that are in different languages, but also as well, you get a real view into extreme wealth. And it's quite shocking, actually. I find it quite shocking.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been kind of looking at, there's a couple of things on Apple TV. One thing about a rich hedge fund, I think it's called Friends and Neighbors or something like that. And he loses his job and he starts stealing from all of his neighbors, and they don't notice the things that they're stealing. And, you know, he's stealing a £250,000 watch, and they don't notice it because the wealth is absolutely obscene. And a heterodox economist will often talk about redistribution. And, you know, and if we go back to kind of the 1950s with J.K. Galbraith talking about the affluent society, this has been a consistent message from heterodox economists for 75 years, that we have enough now and it is about redistributing. But from a neoclassical or mainstream, an orthodox approach, the conversation around distribution never takes place because there is a belief that we can still all have more. So what is the point of taking things away from someone when we can all have more? And we didn't get to touch on this idea of growth and how important it is on our economy. And I would love to, to get James's view on that at another date, because as the audience know, if you're focusing on growth, it sets you down a path that is impossible for you to kind of come back from when you're looking about this idea of redistribution and making sure that everyone has enough. So James, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We're actually going to have a little bit of a break in May, but we will be back in June. So we've got a couple of reports coming out over the next few weeks, so we're going to be concentrating on that. We might have a couple of videos posted on the channel, but no live episodes for a month. I hope you can do without us. Thanks so much for your engagement, and please do keep in touch with us on our various platforms and look out for the information on our publications, which will be coming up very soon. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
Good night.